Hello, good evening. My name is Sarah Salto, and I'm a museum educator with the Best Dunn Museum of Lake County, part of the Lake County Forest Reserves. Thank you for joining us this evening for the first half of the Lake County History Symposium. This year's theme, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Lake County Transportation, shares local transportation stories, including ways Lake County has developed due to the changing modes of transportation and how Lake County has even been impacted by events surrounding transportation. Tonight is the first part of the symposium, and we will have 4 presentations that will be about 20 to 30 minutes each, and then there'll be time for questions after each presentation. The presentations tonight are going to be really fascinating and interesting. They feature automobiles, shipwrecks, train tales, and utilities baron Samuel Insull. This evening's program is also sponsored by USG, making it a free program for everyone attending tonight. And USG sponsors free program as well as free admission to the Dunn Museum every Thursday evening from 5 to 8. So before we begin this program, I do want to introduce the Dunn Museum very quickly to those of you who may not be familiar with us. I encourage you to come visit and see what we have to offer. The museum is located in Libertyville and features permanent exhibits from Lake County history. It covers the history of the area from prehistoric times all the way to present day. In addition to the museum, we do have a lot of online resources that we like to make available to you, including virtual exhibits, a history blog, and an awesome YouTube page, our Dunn TV page. So for more information on how to visit us, planning your visit, and exhibitions, I'm very excited to welcome you all to the Lake County History Symposium as it brings together those interested in actively researching the history of Lake County, Illinois. The goal of this program is to share and present original research done by professionals and history enthusiasts to provide a deeper understanding of local history and recognize its significance in a broader context. We hope you learn more about Lake County history and find new opportunities to visit local history sites and museums. As part of our event, we have created a program guide for you to use throughout this night. This program features a description of each presentation, so you'll see them in order and what they'll be covering in that presentation, but that also features information on the speakers and links to some of their works and organizations. So we hope this is a helpful tool for you to use. All right, so I would like now to start our introduction of our first presentation. The first presentation is All Aboard Deerfield, Train Tales by Donna-Marie Stupple. After 35 years teaching English in Maine Township high schools, Donna retired and discovered local history and joined the board of the Deerfield Area Historical Society. After almost 25 years, she has continued to learn more about Deerfield history, Lake County history, and history in general. As part of the all-volunteer society with 5 historic buildings, there's plenty to do. Over the years, the Stupple team of Donna and Bruce have tackled everything from scrubbing to scanning, restoration to research, cemeteries to celebrations, painting to presentations, and newsletters to networking. So Donna, thank you for joining us tonight, and I am going to turn over to you to share your screen and enjoy the first presentation of our evening. I'm so excited to see all of you here tonight.
Back in the day, and for many, many days thereafter, trains were part of the towns they passed through. They added some vitality and variety to communities. And those are the train stories that I want to talk about today. So please have your ticket ready, watch your step, and all aboard. Trains can create towns, but that was not the case with Deerfield. In 1872, when the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul rolled in, Deerfield was already a thriving farm community of about 150 residents. Freight has always been the moneymaker for trains, and for a farm community, it was now much easier to get farm products into the city. As late as 1907, there were 70 farms north of Deerfield, and perhaps the lady doing a little dance here on the cattle guard belonged to one of those farms, because you see a lovely barn on the left and there are cows in the field on the right. As late as the 1990s, old timers would still refer to the milk train, which used to come through at the crack of dawn. And it would pick up the milk that the farmers had stored in that building to the left of the station, which was called the milk tower. As part of the give and take that there used to be with freight, the trains also took bricks out of Deerfield. There were two major brick yards straddling County Line Road, what we now call as Lake Cook Road. On the Northbrook side, there was the National Brick Company, and on the Deerfield side was the Illinois Brick Company. And that's what you're seeing here in 1929. So it was a pretty big operation, and it butted up to the train tracks. The slogan of the Illinois Brick Company was "a million a day we haul away." And this picture gives you an idea of what part of a million bricks might look like. And you can see one of the train cars in the front of this picture, which already has some bricks loaded on it, because the brickyard, of course, had their own siding. This is another idea of the number of bricks we're talking about shipping out on freight cars. And here's a picture of the train with one of the little a line of cars that was loading those bricks. Decades later, when the brickyards were just a memory, Sara Lee occupied some of that same geography, and they too butted up to the train tracks, and they too had their own little siding. So they could bring in materials like tanker cars full of eggs and hopper cars full of flour, and of course then they would ship out boxcars full of coffee cakes. You could also get houses delivered by train, not complete houses, what you see here, but Sears houses. They were very big in the first quarter of the 1900s, and they were sort of an architectural version of paint by number. So if you wanted to buy a Sears house, you would look through a catalog, because after all, this was still Sears, and you could pick the model of the house you liked. And at times, there could be as many as 450 models to choose from. And then when you had your site ready, everything you needed to build the house would arrive in a boxcar, sometimes two boxcars if you had picked a particularly luxurious model. So all the wood came pre-cut, which was a spectacular advantage in a time when there were no power tools. And every piece of wood had a stenciled ID number on it that connected it to very detailed scale drawings that came with your order. And everything was included. You got all the hardware, you got the doors, the windows, the shingles, the trim, everything you needed. Now, in 1993, the president of our society was an architect, Tom Roth, and he decided to do some research into Sears houses in Deerfield. At that time, he found 15 Sears houses still standing, and these are two of those houses. Now, I took these pictures in 2015 when the Sears houses in Deerfield would be getting close to 100 years old. And you can see that they've held up really well. They look pretty darn nice. And of course, pre-Amazon, mail and packages came by train in dedicated mail cars. So for over 25 years, Oscar Rommel used to pick up the mail, he'd put it in his wheelbarrow, and he'd trundle it across town to the post office, which in 1902 looked like this. Now in 1917, tragedy struck the train station. Very early in the morning, an electrical fire started in the freight room. Directly across the street from the train station was Dr. Davis's house. Now he was not there, but his wife and sister were. And as soon as they saw that smoke coming out of the freight room, they were still in their morning gowns and caps, but they threw propriety to the winds and rushed across the street to start carrying packages out of the freight room to preserve them. Deerfield firefighting equipment at the time was rather simple. This is a cleaned up piece of equipment they were using as an ad when they were trying to raise money to buy their first motorized fire truck, which was not until 1922. And you can see the hose is kind of coiled up in that little basket thing on the top. Now they did manage to save a significant part of the station, which surprises me when I look at the picture of the fire. It was felt, however, that more of the station could have been saved if the Highland Park Fire Department had come more promptly when they were called for help. Now, in defense of Highland Park, they had already come to help on several other fires, not at the train station, but different places in town, and they were still waiting to be paid for that help. So I think we can cut them some slack on this, since they did eventually show up and they did help, and I'm sure that help contributed to saving the station. There was also a rumor that started that German spies had started this fire. This was, after all, World War I going on at the time, but that was totally bogus, and it was completely debunked. No German spies. Even Deerfield's fire alarm system was rather simple. The gentleman in the center is actually sitting in the fire alarm, and this is big iron ring is part of a train wheel, which was donated by the train. Another example how trains interacted with towns then. So if there was a fire, this big ring hung from a tree in the center of town, southeast corner, and you could go there, pick up this pipe and bang on it madly, and that would summon the volunteer fire department. If anyone watching is an old-time Deerfield person, you might notice the building on the right at the back of the picture. That's the original Harry's Grill. Now, passenger trains have not changed as much over the years. But you can see from this picture that there's still a lot of commotion around the activity, because you have cars mixed in with horses, and that one horse doesn't seem any too excited about the idea of Deerfield's first car, which is in front there. It's so easy for us now to get in and out of the city that we might not realize what a game changer easy access to Chicago could have been. And here's an example. These young women were all members of the Amity Club. They had 30 members altogether, so this is about half of the group. And the point of their club was to improve their cultural and social lives. Now, what's remarkable to me is that they formed their club while they were commuting to jobs in Chicago. So that was an opportunity that would never have presented itself to them just in Deerfield. We couldn't have come up with 30 jobs for women at that time. A side benefit of their club was they organized a fundraiser because they wanted to buy books for a lending library for their members. Now, this was not a public library. It was a private lending library, but it was the very first library in Chicago. And when you look at these young women, they're going to be the wives and mothers, the movers and shakers of Deerfield in a few years. And I like to think that their lending library was the seed of an idea on the importance of a public library in a community like Deerfield. Now, not all passengers bothered with tickets. When I think about hobos jumping on boxcars, I always think of the Great Depression. But all through the 1940s, and maybe even a little bit into the 1950s, it was not unusual to have hobos jumping off freight trains in Deerfield and cadging a meal, sometimes doing an odd job, sometimes not, and then jumping back on another train and continuing their ride. I verified this with some folks who had been in elementary school in the 1940s. And they said, yes, no problem at all. It was not unusual to come home from school and find some stranger sitting on your back steps eating a sandwich that your mom had made. I also spoke to some high school students. I spoke to adult males who were high school students back in the 1980s. And they admitted to me that, yes, it was true that occasionally, and very, very occasionally, they stressed, they had jumped onto a slow-moving freight train and stayed on for about a block and a half, and then they would just drop off in front of the high school. Now, this is a great picture for my next story. Unfortunately, it's not even a real boxcar or real hobos, as you notice. This is something you can buy if you have a Lionel or HO train layout. But I have it on very good authority that some of the boys in town used to like to go to what they called the hills north of town next to the train tracks. And the point of it was to play war, because this was the World War II decade. So they would take their BB guns and they would go to those hills And the point of the war game was to shoot at the hobos riding the boxcars. Now, the hobos were totally safe, partially because of the distance between the boys and the boxcars, and partially because of the skill of the boys. But when the hobos figured out what was going on with the game, they actually got into the spirit of the game. So some of them would, fall over into the back of the boxcar pretending they had been hit, and the more dramatically inclined hobos would like kind of lay over the opening there, looking very dramatic. So as the train would pull out of town, they would pop up and wave goodbye to the boys. Now these are old style Milwaukee Road passenger cars, but they're not quite as old as my next story. And that happened about 100 years ago. It's included in the history of Deerfield, which Marie Ward Richelt wrote in 1928. So the story happens about 100 years ago. And this is a group of very unwelcome train passengers. Mrs. Richelt reports that on the midnight train, 200 intoxicated mushroom hunters arrived in Deerfield. And they were joined the following morning at 8 a.m. by another 200 mushroom hunters. And she doesn't comment on the sobriety of that morning group. Deerfield at the time had a population of about 600 and a two-man police force. So you can see that the potential for commotion and chaos here is pretty significant, and it actually happened. So Mrs. Richelt said the amount of damage that was done to fences and fields and barns was significant. And worst of all, she said, they made the night hideous with their singing. Unfortunately, she does not mention how successful the mushroom collecting was. But since this seemed to have been a one-off event, perhaps that's our answer. This was also the golden age of cross-country passenger trains. And one of those at least still runs. This is the Empire Builder, actually went by earlier this afternoon. And it's last November, it stopped unexpectedly. So I was able to go out and get a picture of it. The Empire Builder runs along the northern border of the United States all the way to Seattle. And you can see it's a long train, and I wasn't even able to get the entire train in the picture. But these passenger trains had an interesting variety of cars. Then they had a baggage car, they had a crew car, they had a diner, they had coach cars. If you wanted a private room, you could get a sleeper, you'd be in a sleeper car. They had a club car if you wanted cocktails. And because they were going through such spectacular scenery, they all had observation cars. Different lines had different names, like they might call it the Vista Dome. But this train goes through Glacier National Park and the Cascade Mountains. So it really is a pretty spectacular scenery. But this was not the most legendary train for Deerfield residents. That was the Olympian Hiawatha, which sadly no longer runs. Now, I don't know if it was perhaps the cool name or the cool logo, which you'll get a better look at in a minute. And it certainly didn't hurt that one of the engineers was a Deerfield resident. That's Joe standing next to the engine. But part of the appeal was definitely the way it looked. Now, the trains that I've been talking about pretty much look the same, the engines. They were black, they had smokestacks, and they actually went choo-choo when they started. But the Olympian Hiawatha, as you can see, looked very futuristic. It was a streamliner built for speed, and it looked like it. Now, here's a close-up of the logo, which is, I think, is like a stylized Indian brave with his hair blowing straight out to remind you of how fast the Hiawathas were. And if you are at Union Station over the holidays and the tree is there, you'll notice that the ornaments on the tree are the names of various trains that have been in and out of Union Station over the years. There's quite a few Olympian Hiawatha ornaments hanging on the tree. I highlighted that one. If you follow the arrow down to the middle of the tree, you can see the Olympian Hiawatha in the traditional Milwaukee Road colors. Now, it was the Hiawatha that was the draw for Deerfield kids. And so what they liked to do, and of course you knew when the train was coming, so they would position themselves on the sidewalk that paralleled the train tracks. and they would get into that traditional track star pose. And then as soon as you could see out of the corner of your eye that the train was just about level with you, they would take off like a shot, legs pumping. And the point was to see how long you could keep up with the Olympian Hiawatha and who could keep up the longest. Now, at that point in the route, the Hiawatha was rated for 90 miles an hour. So nobody kept up for very long, but still, it was a lot of fun to try. My last story is a bizarre train crime that led, unfortunately, to the death of two train employees. It's the 1894 Deerfield train robbery. It begins late at night in Deerfield and ends up the next morning in Des Plaines. So the text you see on the right is this little stack of headlines from the newspaper, which gives you the overview of the event. And the line drawings also from the newspaper. And what you're looking at there is the caboose. And here are the details. At 10 o'clock at night, the train stops in Deerfield to get water. And we had a little water tank in Deerfield for quite a long time. Just seconds after the train stops, two masked men climb into the caboose and they rob the conductor of his watch and his pocket money. The train detective is also in the caboose at the time. When he reaches for his rifle, one of the masked men shoots and kills him. Then they force the conductor to uncouple the car so that the rest of the train is going to be pulling away. And they're planning to jump out of the car and take off cross country. Meanwhile, at the part of the train that's pulling away, the brakeman, who was robbed and assaulted just minutes before this caboose part happened, he's recovered enough to drop off the moving cars and go back to the train station so that they can telegraph warnings to the stations in the vicinity that these two criminals might be heading their way. Now that's the end of the Deerfield piece of the Deerfield train robbery. But the next big event happens at 5:30 the next morning. So the criminals, who appear to be phenomenal cross-country runners, have intercepted a train on the Northwestern tracks. They've climbed aboard and they're heading for the Mayfair station, which is the very north edge of Chicago. Now, at the Mayfair station, the night operator and the train watchman have picked up the telegraph warning, and they realize that if the criminals jumped on a train, it's going to be the train that will be arriving or coming through their station shortly. So the watchman decides he's going to swing aboard that train and check the cars to see if the criminals are there. Unfortunately, the criminals see him before he sees them. One of the criminals pulls out an Army Colt revolver, fires 3 shots at the watchman. One shatters his gun arm, one goes who knows where, and the other one wounds him in the chest, and 2 days later he'll die from that wound. So again, the killers jump off the train. This time they start heading west through what the newspaper said is open farm country, because this was, after all, 1894. So as they're escaping, or hoping they're escaping, they intercept a horse-drawn wagon, a farmer, a daughter, and vegetables, which they're taking to the Chicago markets. So the criminals dump the farmer, the daughter, and the vegetables, turn the surprised horse around, and continue their flight west. As this goes on, by this time, mounted policemen are now pursuing them, and the policemen have been joined by a group of irate farmers who probably don't know much about what happened on the train, but they are definitely not happy about what's happened to the farmer, the daughter, and the vegetables. So the entire group proceeds west. Over 100 bullets are fired. Additional policemen join the fray. And by about 9:30, the criminals decide it would be wise to surrender. They've been wounded, they're out of ammunition, they're exhausted. I suspect the horse is exhausted, so they give up. At this point, the police have to change from being pursuers to being protectors, because the farmers would just as soon end everything then and there, vigilante style. The police prevail, the criminals are arrested, and they end up in jail. And that's the end of the Deerfield train robbery of 1894. Now, my house faces the train tracks. My street was originally called East Railway Avenue, and there's a train layout in my basement. Well, when I sit on my front porch and I watch over a mile of identical black oil cars roll by, I really miss those old trains and the way they used to interact with the towns. And most of all, I really wish I could see a caboose again. So thank you for riding with me. Hope you liked the trip.
Great, Donna. Thank you so much for sharing this wonderful presentation. I do have to say, we got lots of reactions from when you put the hat on. There was lots of hearts and emojis coming up, so I think that's a hit.
Oh,
If you've seen Donna present for us in the past for the symposium, she added a little. She always adds a little nice touch. So please feel free to put in any questions into the Q&A box or into the chat. We do have one question that has come in. They said, wasn't there a train derailment in the 1970s near the Deerfield train station?
uh,
Um,
yes, yes. Actually, I think it was more like in the 1980s, late 1980s. But and I was. It sounds rather strange to see this. I was interested to see it because it had dawned on me that I wondered, what would happen if a train derailed? Would like a boxcar be in my living room, or what would be the situation? And if the train derailed now, we'd be talking about something much different because recent derailments of trains have included toxic chemicals and problems with that oil. But back in at the derailment you're talking about, that was just like a normal old-fashioned freight train. So it did derail. It derailed right by Greenwood Avenue, which is maybe a block or so north of the train station. And fortunately, it was a freight, so nobody got hurt. And the train cars just kind of fell off onto the sides. They didn't even block the roads near it. It turns out that the railroad people have like a national crew that rushes around to fix train derailments. This happened, I think, on a Friday or Saturday morning. So they were able to clear the tracks enough that they got the commuter things running. And I did get some great pictures. So, and my concerns about what would happen were allayed. It might be safe. So,
Thanks for answering that. And then there's one other question here. Did Deerfield gain notoriety for its no kissing zones in the 1980s, or when do you have information on Deerfield getting notoriety for its no kissing zones?
yeah, right. I was actually going to include those pictures because that was all kinds of little memorabilia, souvenirs being sold in Deerfield about that. Uh, it, so the idea was commuters were clogging up the getting in and out of the station in the morning because of the kissing goodbye. So they put up these a no kissing zone signs, and so the kissing zone, no kissing zone, in order to keep the traffic moving more gracefully. And they were up for quite a long time, as dated now as they seem. And when you look at it, the picture of the woman, she's got like rollers in her hair. I mean, it's really pretty old fashioned. So there was a little interest in that a couple of years ago. Kind of came back again. And I have to say this: the village used to sell tiles that had various Deerfield landmarks on it. Those sold out. They were the really popular sellers. So kind of put us on the map in a rather entertaining way.
Well, thank you, Donna, so much. And if you have questions for Donna, please put them in the chat and we can review those. There will be hopefully one more chance to answer them later. And someone has asked Donna if you can share information on how to reach you. We can also put that in the chat for you. But now we will say goodbye to Donna. I told Donna she can now go have her glass of wine and enjoy the rest of the presentations. Her hard work is done. So our next presentation of the evening is Sam Insel and the Creation of Modern Lake County by John Wasik. Wasik is the author of the award-winning The Merchant of Power, Samuel Insel, and the Creation of Modern Metropolis. Supported by original research, the book explored how utilities baron Sam Insel sought to create modern suburbia through his multiple holding companies that range from Commonwealth Edison to the North Shore Line. John is also the author of 18 other books, including his most recent, Lincolnomics. And he did a great presentation for us at the Dunn Museum on that. That was fabulous. So I encourage you to check out some of his other titles too. John is also the Lake County Forest Preserve and Lake County Board Commissioner. So he does serve on our board. And we're grateful that he is here tonight to share all his history knowledge and fascinating information on Samuel Insull. So I will turn it over to you, John, now. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Nicole, and what an excellent presentation by Donna. I really enjoy all sorts of train stories, and I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into Sam Insull, who was very instrumental in creating modern Lake County. A lot of people know him from his ownership of ComEd and the North Shore Line. I'll be getting in a little bit more detail, but it's based on my book, The Merchant of Power, which I wrote about 10 years ago. And it was really about how Insull created the modern electrical grid in the second industrial revolution around the turn of the century. So I had a lot of fun with this story, mostly because, I like to think that he was the Bill Gates of the 1920s. Not that he was a big technologist. He was not an inventor. He was primarily a businessman who controlled a lot of things. But he was Thomas Edison's protege. He came across from England as a young man in his 20s to be Thomas Edison's secretary. Among other things, Thomas Edison was not a good business person. He was pretty disorganized, and Insull pretty much ran his businesses. But when he came out to Lake County in early 20th century, he started this thing called the Lake County experiment. And in Insull's view, this was his vision for creating a modern electrical grid in the suburbs that would connect to the city as well. A lot of you may be familiar with the Pink Mansion, which is a Cuneo estate. I'll have a picture of that a little bit later. And he built the power plant in Waukegan to serve as a major generator for the suburbs that would grow up around his home in Libertyville. And he also bought the North Shore Line when it was kind of failing and created a real first-class commuter railroad, which of course made commuting to the city, and it ran from Mundelein downtown. It was an all-electric line, which of course meant he could sell power to them and bring people out here and also bring them downtown. But then, later in his empire building, he also bought a bank. He was in the real estate development. He owned some land and several companies that, of course, controlled all of this. So he had this master plan for creating a metropolis by selling people electricity. He was a very famous guy in the 1920s. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine. He was a celebrity businessman. Most everybody knew him throughout the country. As the utilities mogul, he created what they called a regulated monopoly, was very successful with that. And of course, he was, gained his initial fame as being Thomas Edison's protege. But he also built his country estate in Libertyville, more or less because he had this English idea. He was from England, that he would be a gentleman farmer. What became Melody Farms. He had some prize horses. He had some cows. But his bigger vision, of course, was to connect the country to the city of Chicago and create, modern commuters and a commuter-based economy. But to do that, he had to build a power plant, a big one, and create the local electrical grid. And of course, buying the North Shore line connected people to the suburbs. So here's his mansion. So I'm going to show you a picture that probably nobody can see is his pink mansion in Vernon Hills. It's now the Cuneo Museum. But what he did, he was the first person to start selling electricity to the masses. I'm showing you a picture of an ad for a GE flat iron. And what he would do is he would go through the streets with electric trucks and give away free electric flat irons. Of course, the catch was that nobody had electricity and they needed it to run the flat irons, which were a lot safer than the ones you put on the wood stove. So housewives would say to their husbands when they got home, darling, Mr. Insel gave me this free iron and I won't burn myself and I can get your clothes ironed faster. And the husband would say, but darling, we don't have electricity. And the wife would say, well, I think it's time we got it because, you know, this will reduce wear and tear on the clothes. I will spend less time ironing and we could spend more time together with the family. So that was one of his big pitches. And he started this before World War I. And then at the eve of World War I, he was pitching the economic benefits of electricity. He would show like a dark house with for rent sign on it. It would say, you know, annual rent would only, you know, be $420 a month for this huge house. And then a lit up house with electricity could rent for $540 a month. So he was pitching the economic benefits of electricity to people. And it was a pretty neat thing if you didn't have it and you wanted it. So after World War I, he started a different marketing campaign and he linked electricity to domestic labor savings. And he had this funny ad called, "How long should a wife live?" In the old days, she didn't live very long because she didn't have electricity. So that was the pitch. This is about 1925. And it would create this demand for wiring your house with electricity. So that was very successful. And more people got wired during the 20s. And then he had a big plan to sell homes, mortgages, and power all of Lake County. But of course, and I'm showing a picture of the Harris Bank at Cook and Milwaukee and Libertyville, which was Insel's sort of local headquarters. And he had the bank and the real estate company and an appliance store in that one building. So if you go by it, there's a little plaque in the corner, and that was his empire. So 1929, of course, comes along and everything comes crashing down. He loses all of his holding companies. He had more than 100 of them that he controlled. They all invested in stock in each other, and the whole empire blew up. So he figured he wasn't going to get a free trial here, or a fair trial rather, and he went to Europe and was hanging out there. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt brought him back for trial, and he was tried for fraud 3 times, and he was acquitted. And the whole issue then was that he spent everything he could, what was remaining of his fortune, to try to bail people out and his companies. And I guess the juries didn't think that was, you know, criminal. So he got off that way. So his legacy is really important because it led to rural and suburban electrification. Of course, in the 1930s, during the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt started the Rural Electrification Agency and started to wire everybody, no matter where they lived. Of course, it also led to commuter rail. Of course, Metro is the result of that. And if you want to see where the North Shore line actually ran, you can take the North Shore Trail, which runs roughly from the Des Plaines River Trail to right around Carmel High School and Mundelein, and then kind of stops. We're hoping to extend that a little bit further to get to another forest preserve trail. That's a work in progress. And he also really was a big advocate of farm electrification. He had a model farm just outside of Mundelein that really showed the benefits of electrifying a farm. He had like electric milking devices and things like that, and he put on display. But the big plan was to build on this, what he called the central station model, which is to have a big power plant powering a local area. And they were all coal-fired plants. And what's left of that is, of course, the Waukegan power plant, which is in the process of shutting down. Unfortunately, the legacy created a lot of toxic coal ash, which we are trying to get safely removed and disposed of somewhere else. And it's a real problem, and it's right on the shore of Lake Michigan. So we don't want that toxic coal ash leaking into the lake, which is our drinking water source. But, you know, hopefully, like a lot of other plants in the country, will be replaced by renewable energy, which is in ever greater demand. So that was the Insel story. I'm sorry the slides didn't come out. We've had some technical issues, and this is one of them. So I'd be happy to take some questions if you have any.
You did a great, awesome presentation covering some of the really important developments of Samuel Insull. And there was a question that has come in. What was Samuel Insull's role in the development of neighborhoods, specifically in Libertyville?
Well, of course, they were largely attracted to getting there from the city through the North Shore line. And I have to say that was a very fast railroad and a very fancy one for the time. Because it was electric, it could go almost 100 miles an hour, and it would take people, to their office and then into the suburbs. So Libertyville was pretty much developed around that concept, which later, of course, became the Metro line. And he also was very instrumental in this sort of integrated model where he would be selling the land, he would be issuing mortgages. Of course, that all fell apart at the beginning of the Depression, but he tried to be a mogul of all this stuff, and it just blew up.
Yeah.
I see another question here. What did he have to do with the Civic Opera House? Well, Insull loved opera. He had gone to the opera when he was a young man in London, and he just adored opera. And he built the opera house, the Civic Opera House, and it opened right as the market was crashing. So at that time, he was kind of in hot water with a lot of people had sold his stock to, and but the opera house is still there. And the principle there was that the opera would own the space that they were working in, so they'd never have to worry about getting kicked out. And is the cookhouse Sam Insull's? No, that was Ansel Cook's house, and everybody thinks it was Sam Insull's, but it wasn't. And it was funny, but the back end of the opera house, which faces the Chicago River, people would joke that that was Insull's throne, and they would make up these stories that, well, he was looking west for building his empire, and he looked across the river to future development. That's kind of an apocryphal story. More or less, it was a building that mimicked the Daily News building, which had a similar design, kind of Art Deco, giantism sort of theme there. So that was one of the things that he had done.
Yeah, and John, there's one more question here too. Are there any remaining portions of the North Shore line? Are there stations, tracks, or trains still active?
The only thing that remains, Sarah, is the North Shore path, and that's literally on the right of way that the train would have gone through. So you can walk it or bike it or jog it. Goes right through Libertyville, a little bit of Mundelein, kind of stops just about a couple blocks west of Carmel High School, and hopefully the Village of Mundelein will extend it through. That was really an amazing sort of way to get into the suburbs from the city. It was really fast, and it had a club car and a dining car and a smoking car. It was really pretty elaborate stuff for the time.
Is there any Samuel Insull family left?
Not that I know of. He had one son, and I don't know if there's any Insulls left. Somebody asked me that years ago, and I couldn't really find any trace of them. Sam Insull Jr. built a house on Countryside Lake in Mundelein. He was here for a while, and he stood trial. He was on trial for fraud with his father, and he was acquitted too.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing this information with us, John, and night. So please feel free to reach out to John, go to his website to learn more, and lots of really great comments and reactions. So thank you, John, for joining us tonight. Our third presentation of the evening is Lost on the Lady Elgin by Valerie van Heest. Valerie van Heest, originally from Wilmette, is a trustee of the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago. She is the preeminent historian on the Lady Elgin shipwreck, leading the archaeological survey, testifying on behalf of the state of Illinois over ownership of the wreck, appearing on television's Drain the Ocean, designing a museum exhibit, and writing the book Lost on the Lady Elgin, which has won 3 awards. Valerie has spearheaded the discovery of 20 Lake Michigan shipwrecks, conducted surveys of over 50 plus shipwrecks, written 7 maritime books, and designed numerous museum exhibits. She is recognized for her work preserving and promoting Great Lakes maritime history by receiving many awards, appearing in episodes on the History Channel, and featured in countless print, television, and radio news stories. I think this is one of my favorite facts about Valerie is that she has been inducted to the Women Divers Hall of Fame, which is incredible. I wasn't even sure that existed. So thank you, Valerie, so much for being here tonight and sharing your work with us on the Lady Elgin.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And Donna wore her conductor's hat, so I think I'm supposed to wear this when I'm presenting, but I think that would be a little hard, so we'll set that down. But indeed, I was inducted into the Women Divers Hall of Fame for my work documenting and preserving shipwrecks. And there's no shipwreck that's more important to me in my career than the Lady Elgin. And since my book debuted in 2010, I've had the honor to share this story with multiple audiences over, gosh, 3 decades. And the presentations that have had the most impacted by this tragedy. Milwaukee is one of them. There were over 200 citizens from Milwaukee lost in this accident. Chicago was the site where the last photograph of the Lady Elgin was taken and where victims were laid out just 24 hours after that photo was taken. And tonight I'm here talking with Lake County residents, and that's significant to the Lady Elgin because the accident happened right 165 years ago. All the book cover that I just talked about. And my personal connection with the palatial sidewheel steamer is rather unique. It began in 1992 when I first saw this awe-inspiring sight on the wreck of the Lady Elgin. It's a musket destined to see battle in the Civil War if the ship that it had been transported on had not sunk. Now, that musket became symbolic for the Lady Elgin because the ship had been chartered as a fundraising excursion to repay the debt of having per diver back then, and I was thrilled to be diving on one of the Great Lakes' most famous shipwrecks. It's famous as the most palatial steamer on the Great Lakes when it was built in 1851, and it was bestowed a royal name in honor of Lady Mary Bruce, the Countess of Elgin. It's also famous as the deadliest disaster on the open waters of the Great Lakes with the loss of over 300 people. And it's famous because after the discovery of its wreckage, it was the subject of the lengthiest legal battle over a Great Lakes ship. Now, let me tell you about this fateful trip. In the 9th season of its operation, Captain Jack Wilson piloted the Lady Elgin out of the Milwaukee Harbor on the evening of September 7, 1860. The ship carried a large contingent of members, family, and friends of the Independent Union Guards that was a militia group in Chicago. The Union Guards sold tickets on the Lady Elgin for $1 a piece, and this was a fundraiser to repay the debt for having purchased 80 refurbished flintlock muskets to rearm their unit for potential war. This is actually the white document is a Civil War era document showing the purchase of those muskets. Now, the palatial steamer arrived in Chicago the next morning. It was an overnight run, and it regularly served this panoramic painting of Chicago. That's the Lady Elgin that happened to be pictured in that particular illustration. So the Lady Elgin came into the river. It docked at LaSalle Street at the north end of what is today Chicago's Loop. And it was captured in this photograph taken the very morning the Lady Elgin arrived. It shows throngs of exciting excursions, many of them Irish immigrants who had never seen Chicago. This was the second and the last photo ever taken of this ship. Now, the Independent Union Guards, led by Captain Garrett Berry, departed the Lady Elgin, and they paraded through the streets of Chicago to show off their newly purchased muskets. and their support for Stephen Douglas, one of the presidential candidates running against Abraham Lincoln. And that was in the upcoming volatile election that was being fought in 1860, largely over the issues of slavery. Where have we ever in our lives? Can't imagine. Well, after a day of sightseeing and campaigning through the streets of Chicago, the Union Guards and their supporters returned to the Lady Elgin for the return trip to Milwaukee. Now, the Lady Elgin also took aboard with Captain Wilson, they took aboard a herd of cattle that were being transported north. Can you imagine the stench on that ship? But that was just a part of life in the 1860s. Now, despite a dropping barometer, Captain Wilson steered the Lady Elgin from the dock and he steamed north towards Milwaukee into the teeth of a brewing storm and unexpectedly into the path of a southbound schooner. Now, I'm going to play for you a little reenactment of here's what happened that night 165 years ago.
At about 2:30 a.m., Captain Darius Malott of the lumber schooner Augusta spotted the lights of a steamer heading toward him. He commanded his wheelsman to take evasive action. At that same instant, Captain John Wilson of the Lady Elgin saw a shocking sight, the silhouette of a lumber-laden schooner bearing down on him. He immediately commanded. The helm was slow to respond in the stormy seas. Suddenly, the Lady Elgin heeled over as the terrible sound of splintering wood signaled disaster. The Augusta had pierced the Lady Elgin on its port side, ripping through the side wheel and into the main cabin. Seconds later, a monstrous wave swept the helpless schooner away, revealing a massive gash. Water poured in as pandemonium broke out on the steamer. Realizing his ship was mortally wounded, Captain steered toward shore, jettisoned the cattle, launched the lifeboats, and warned the passengers. Soon the boilers crashed through the bottom of the boat, and the Lady Elgin broke in two, sending hundreds of men, women, and children into the churning waters.
For those who survived the sinking, the nightmare was just beginning.
The full force of the thunderstorm struck after the collision. Flashes of lightning revealed scores of terrified people, unable to swim, climbing onto the backs of cattle only to drown with them. The lake was strewn with floating wreckage and the bodies of the dead and dying that could be seen in the flashes of lightning. The sounds of prayers and curses were heard on all sides. As they struggled to survive the storm, the bow section of the Lady Elgin drifted south with the waves until its trailing anchor chain caught upon a boulder, holding it fast at that spot until the last remnant of the Queen of the Lakes finally sank to the bottom.
Well, after that terrible night, the next morning, the lake was littered with the bodies of the dead and dying from Lake County all the way down to Cook County. The first survivors from the ship came ashore at the lakefront home of Jared Gage, and that's in Winnetka. Incidentally, that house is still standing there today. And so when those survivors came ashore, word of the accident spread all along the lakeshore and down to Chicago. And the next day, newspapers announced the alarming calamity. Over 300 people had died, and among the victims was Captain Jack Wilson and Commander Garrett Berry of the Independent Unit Guards. Now, in the wake of the presidential election and the outbreak of civil war, memories of the Lady Elgin accident faded until 129 years later, Elgin was discovered. So this discovery.
Memories were all that remained of the Lady Elgin until 1989, 129 years later.
The very first piece that we found that told us it was actually Lady Elgin's a schooner. It has Steamboat Lady Elgin engraved in the handles.
Harry Zyke, a well-known Chicago salver, found the sidewheel steamer off the North Shore in an undisclosed location. His proof? Artifacts from the Lady Elgin like the ship's whistle.
It was the voice of the ship. It was the last thing that was heard that night as the vessel was sinking.
And there are more artifacts. An 1843 Springfield rifle, a china plate and knife, a chandelier, and the ship's seal.
Well, Zyk's recovery of those artifacts was controversial. The newly enacted Abandoned Shipwreck Act that had been signed into law by President Ronald Reagan transferred ownership of abandoned shipwrecks to the states in which they were located. Now, this was a law that had been designed to protect shipwrecks for historical study. And the law made the recovery of artifacts without a permit, disturbing a crime scene. Removing artifacts before a proper survey is done can lead to the loss of historical information. And that's especially troubling with a ship as significant as the Lady Elgin. Well, Harry Zyk defended his actions, claiming that because the wreck was located somewhere about 3 miles off Highland Park in just 50 feet of water, he thought the location would leak to local divers. And he feared that if he had not recovered all these artifacts, other divers would vandalize the site. And instead, he hoped that a museum would offer to showcase the artifacts that he had recovered. Well, Zyk's decision to bring up those artifacts without a permit landed him in court. The state of Illinois used this as a test case to enforce the new law that had been enacted to protect historic shipwrecks from just this sort of thing, looting. Well, Zyk hired an attorney named Paul Keller, lower left corner, and together they established a nonprofit organization called the Lady Elgin Foundation, and their mission was to preserve and exhibit the artifacts. Well, Zyk's plan seemed lofty, but his real motive was revealed in closed-door testimony I happened to be in 1992 because I was testifying. And Zyk admitted in court ship, but laying in a debris field, and inside he found 70 gold and silver coins. Now, the currency, he said, was a face value of only $313, but those were $20 double eagles, and all those coins together, I've looked at the worth, it's about $100,000 in today's money. So in order to keep the coins that he'd recovered, Zyk would have to win ownership of the shipwreck. So as the complex legal battle played out, the judge granted the state of Illinois an opportunity to conduct an archaeological survey before any more historical information was lost. And as Zyk predicted, the location of the wreck had leaked among the dive community. And surprisingly, it wasn't contained in a single site like most shipwrecks, but in 5 distinct sites that were scattered over a mile of lake bottom. This is really notable. There are no other shipwrecks in the Great Lakes like this. So Illinois turned to an organization that I was running at the time, the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago, and asked us to conduct a survey on the remains. So in September of 1992, we headed out to the site of one of those areas of wreckage. We geared up, we got in the water, we went down, we didn't know what we were gonna see, but the first site we ended up diving on was the site of the Lady Elgin's 2 boilers. There is no other portions of the ship down there. Just these 2 boilers. They're about 20 feet long. They used to sit upright. They're laying on their sides here. We surveyed all around the boilers. Here's a boiler support. That's a piece of iron that's about 13 feet long. A lot of debris there. This is one of the doors leading into the boilers. These were wood-powered boilers. There's another grate door. You see one of the grates inside that was inside the boiler, that long, slender piece of metal. And then you see one of the vents that would have vented the steam out of the boiler in the background there. Now consider these 2 boilers laying on their sides down there. This is what they would have looked like inside the Lady Elgin. It's a different ship, but very similar. They were bolted in place. They were on the very lowest deck of the ship. So catastrophic. that these boilers were just ripped off their mounts, tumbled out of the hole in the Lady Elgin, and spilled out onto the lake bottom. My early career was in architecture, and so I was the chief illustrator for this project, and I created a site plan of how those boilers and some debris are scattered around them. And that was all part of a survey document that we were preparing for the state of Illinois. Well, the next area that we surveyed was what we've called the debris field. And that's because, again, no portions of the ship, just a lot of different debris. Let me show you some of it. This is, if any of you can determine what it is, it's about 4 feet long. It's about 3 feet high. It was part of the cargo being shipped north to the Lake Superior region. It was a cast iron cook stove, new technology at the time. A ladder that led from the deck up to the pilot house is laying there. This is a spittoon. You all know what a spittoon was used for. There were a number of these scattered throughout the ship. This is a capstan. It's about 4 feet tall. It's laying on its side. It was part of a device that would help raise the anchors. I want you to keep this image in mind because later I'm going to show you how the capstan was at one time configured in the Lady Elgin. We also found a lot of artifacts that had a covering of sand, and so when we fanned the sand, it revealed a serving platter that shows us that the Lady Elgin had very fine table appointments. This was a gauge from the engine room, so while we had found some things from the dining room, we were also finding artifacts from the engine room. And this is a hand truck. There would have been probably 20 different hand trucks on the ship. They would have been used to load luggage and cargo into the ship. So all manner of debris, boiler room tools. This one, just to appreciate it, is about 4 feet long. These were giant tools. And this really stymied us when we first documented it. We had no idea what it is. It's about, it's about 10 inches by 10 inches. I'll give you a chance to maybe figure out what it is, and then I'll show you, I'll reveal. It's the rotary valves from a brass horn that would have belonged to one of the members of Milwaukee's city band that was on board the Lady Elgin. I hope some of you figured that out before I told you. The musket that I first showed you, there were actually 11 muskets in the debris field, and we were able to get a little bit of a close look at it despite the growth and the zebra mussels on it. We were able to tell that this was indeed a flintlock musket that had been altered with a percussion cap, and those muskets were refurbished, and they cost the Independent Union Guards $2 a piece when they were bought as refurbished artifacts. So creating this site plan was difficult. It was a scattering of artifacts about the size of a football field. And we created a complete inventory with photographs and video. And then the third site we documented is one of the paddle wheels. The paddle wheels were connected with an iron shaft about 18 inches diameter. You can see the shaft in the middle, I think you fit. And there's one wheel, and then 500 feet from there is the other wheel. So we can understand the devastation of the collision. And the last section, we call it the bow section. It's the largest concentration of ship structure. And I'm going to show you some video that we shot in 1992. So this is not high definition like you would see today. So this piece that we're filming right here is called a hogging arch. You see the gentle curve to it. I'll show you a photograph later of that. It's about 30 feet long. Now, about 50 feet from the hogging arch, we start to see some of the hull. Now, this is the inside portion of the ship. It's been splayed open after all that time underwater. There's about 85 feet of the bow section here. The Lady Elgin was 256 feet long, so we're not even seeing half of the ship here. You're starting to see some anchor chains, so we realize that we're approaching the bow. When we did this work, we filmed it with video cameras with still images. You see a tape measure there. We were measuring the ship. look off in the distance, you see a giant woodstock anchor. Some of the, and there's our photographer shooting a picture of that anchor. And look down under the woodstock anchor, you're going to see another anchor. You'll see that better. The chain goes through an oval divide, protects the wood. You see the other anchor there, collapsible stock. I wear a necklace that has a collapsible stock anchor on it. That's the windlass. The windlass was part of a dual piece of machinery that helped raise the anchors. The windlass and the capstan worked together. And the anchor chain was partially wrapped around the windlass, but it was splayed out on the bottom of the lake. And so we followed the anchor chain out, not knowing what we were going to find. We've already seen the anchors. So what's at the other end of the anchor chain? Well, it turns out it's a giant boulder. That's just a natural structure there that the chain hooked upon. So here's my site plan showing the bow section. As I said, it filleted open. The hogging arch on the right, other sections of the hull. I would say it's only about a quarter of this whole ship. The hogging arch that we first saw in the video, we were able to match that to the hogging arch on the one good photograph that we had of the Lady Elgin. And we realized that what we see on the bottom is like the pieces of a giant jigsaw puzzle. We had to really study the ship to understand what we were looking at. Now there's a photograph of that windlass, and here's a diagram showing you how the windlass was located on the lower deck. The capstan was located above it. They were geared together to help raise those heavy anchors. And what's so fascinating about this is the bow was about 3/4 of a mile south of the debris field where the capstan was found. So imagine what was going on that night and how that ship was being ripped apart by first the collision and then by the storm. Really devastating. Well, the legal outcome of this case took quite some time. And although the state of Illinois fought hard to assert its ownership of the Lady Elgin, that was not to be. After a 10-year legal battle with multiple rulings, several appeals, a failed consent decree, the Illinois Supreme Court decided that the Lady Elgin had never been abandoned by the insurance company, and it awarded title of the Lady Elgin shipwreck to Harry Zyke and his nonprofit Lady Elgin Foundation. Now, that wasn't the outcome that I felt was best, but I hoped that Harry Zyke would be finally able to mount a museum exhibit that he had been talking about for 10 years. And so over the next few years, we understand that he approached nearly every maritime museum in the Great Lakes, offering up his artifacts to make an exhibit with. But what never reached the newspapers was the fact that he was asking $100,000. And I think any of you that are involved with museums, you know, museums do not pay money for artifacts. So apparently he was more interested in profit than preservation. No museum agreed to buy the artifacts. He would not donate them, and they languished in, believe it or not, in his basement, and they are still there, and he passed away in 2016. Now, I continued to pursue my studies of the Lady Elgin from 1992 on to the 2010 when I wrote the book. I offered lectures on the topic continually, and it was when I was being asked to lecture at the 150th anniversary of the Lady Elgin sinking that I decided that it was finally time to write the book. I had never understood why, with the deadliest disaster on the Great Lakes, nobody had tackled this subject. It's been written about a lot in articles, but never a book. And so in 2010, my book came out in hardback, and it ended up winning 3 awards. One of them was from the State of Illinois Historical Society. So I was very proud of that. Thank you for those hearts and claps. So the Lady Elgin today. As the 160th anniversary of the sinking approach, so 10 years after I wrote the book, I began discussing the possibility of creating an exhibit about the Lady Elgin with my client, the Chicago Maritime Museum. We expected that the undertaking might be possible now that Harry Zyke had passed away. However, his family and his attorney, they were still not swayed by the idea of sharing these objects with the public for the sake of history. They still wanted a monetary benefit. And so my hopes for a proper exhibit began to fade away. But then a chance encounter that I had with a retired diver would change all that. The man who wishes to remain anonymous told me about a large collection of artifacts that he had recovered from the Lady Elgin in the 1990s, and he did so with the permission of Harry Zyke, who had won legal ownership of the wreck. He did some commercial diving work for Harry, and in return, he was allowed to take these artifacts. Now, artifacts such as this engraved utensil noting the name Steamboat Lady Elgin on the handle, and muskets matching the muskets that we had documented in the debris field were the proof of their provenance. And I finally had the opportunity to study these objects up close, something that I had longed to do since I had first seen that musket on the bottom of Lake Michigan. So that anonymous diver was willing to donate 160 artifacts to the Chicago Maritime Museum, and that's where they are now, preserved in perpetuity. And those artifacts tell the story of an elegant ship, but one that was inherently fragile and weak. They illuminate an era when the country was on the brink of civil war, and they honor the militiamen willing to fight to keep the Union whole. And they provide archaeological evidence like this paddle wheel blade. And that helps us understand how the ship was constructed, because there are no construction drawings for that ship. And they remind us of the dangers that the crew faced in the course of doing their regular jobs. And most significantly, those artifacts serve to remember the hundreds of individuals whose lives were cut short by that tragic collision. So the exhibit, called Lady Elgin, Treasures from the Shipwreck, opened this summer at the Chicago Maritime Museum. It's certainly been a long time coming, 35 years after the discovery of the Lady Elgin. And the exhibit provides details about the ship, the excursion, the discovery, and what was learned by studying the shipwreck. And it showcases that new collection of artifacts. So just last year, a new edition of my book was published, and it includes photographs of the shipwreck and images of many of those newly donated artifacts, so that this tragic accident will never be forgotten. So I hope that you'll consider picking up a copy of the book. It's on Amazon. Just search under the name Lost on the Lady Elgin. And I hope you'll visit the Chicago Maritime Museum for additional insights. I've only covered the tip of the iceberg with this story. We hope that this tragic accident will never be forgotten. And remember, it took place just off the shores of Lake County, Illinois, 165 years ago, this coming September. Thank you very much.
Wow, Valerie, that was so wonderful and fabulous. I have heard of the story of the Lady Elgin, and I've been fascinated by it, but seeing those underwater photos, oh my gosh, that was just like mind blowing. And knowing what you guys have gone through to get this information and the artifacts and the exhibit, it was really, really wonderful to hear it all.
Yeah.
So
Thank
thank
you.
you so much, everyone, for joining us with that. All right, let's see. Questions. So first question is, where is the museum located? People, we put the link in the chat, but if you just want to let people know briefly where that is.
Yes. Sure. If you Google, there's a website, but it's in the south side of Chicago in the Bridgeport neighborhood. If you can get to Sox Park, it's about 2 miles west of Sox Park.
Okay.
Easy to get to, free parking.
Oh, that is also good to know.
Yep.
So someone wants to know, is there a list of the victims at the exhibit or at the Maritime Museum?
Well, there's not a list there, but in the back of my book, there is a list. And I worked with a Milwaukee historian, Carl Baer, who had put together this list, allowed me to publish it. There are 302 victims and 96 survivors. And I believe it was about 75% of them were Union Guard excursionists from Milwaukee. A mix of them, survivors and victims.
Someone also wants to know, in that vein of victims, how many cattle were lost? Do you know how many cattle were lost in this?
Yeah, we think between 50 and 150 head of cattle. It was very vague, but there were accounts where survivors rode to shore on the carcasses of dead cows.
Wow.
So they served as life preservers, I guess.
Yeah. So there are a couple questions coming in about the boat that hit the Lady Elgin.
Yes.
And what happened to the other schooner.
Well, you have to buy the book and read it to find out. But no, actually, there's quite a struggle. Later that day, it limped into Chicago. It was considered a cursed vessel. It had to hightail it out of Chicago because people were actually ready to lynch the crew because they had not stayed to rescue people. But when you consider what was going on in the storm that night, you realize rescue would have been impossible for a little schooner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's definitely more theories out there about that. So check out Valerie's book. Is the Lady Elgin featured in any of the Drain the Ocean TV episodes?
Well, I did appear on Drain the Ocean about 2 years ago. It's on an episode that deals with Chicago. So I think you'd have to do some Googling to number in the series it was. But they did interview me and they did go out with divers to look at the wreck. So it was an interesting little segment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely Google for see what episode it is and let us know if someone finds it while we're here and Googling tonight.
Yeah.
And then this is the last question. If we were kayaking from Highland Park Beach, would we be able to see anything of the wreck from the surface on a calm day?
Well, I don't think you would. It's 50 feet. The boilers are the biggest objects that stand bottom, but still there'd be about 4. It would have to be high noon and unusually calm. I don't recommend it. 3 miles is a long way to kayak.
Yeah,
Safety first.
Especially on Lake Michigan. Great. So I actually just have one personal question, since I do like this topic too. This might be a little bit of a weird question too, but I've heard of some ghost stories off the Lady Elgin. Have you heard any kind of spooky sightings, or people reported any,
Well, I think whenever there's a loss of life, certain people can feel, but I have to say, just yesterday I did an interview with a Milwaukee reporter about the supposed Great Lakes, the Michigan Triangle. And I had to say, that there is no truth to that. These Great Lakes are dangerous bodies of water. And there's nothing really mysterious about what, happens to ships. I haven't heard any ghost stories, but, I've gotten to know a lot of the victims through about the remember them is to never let this story be forgotten. 165 years has passed. This is the greatest disaster in all the Great Lakes. It happened off the shores of your community. I, by the way, grew up in Wilmette. I was born while my parents lived in Libertyville, so I'm from that area as well. And we just can't let this be forgotten. And interestingly, just my closing thought is, in 1850 by fire on the water. And there were no regulations for what ships had to do when they were meeting, on potentially a collision course. Anytime you have new technology, accidents can happen. And what comes to mind is we're in a period now where people are starting to develop self-driving cars. How many people are going to die in self-driving car accidents before that technology has been refined? So we just have to keep in mind that the Lady Elgin was an early accident as maritime engineers and people that regulate the transportation on the Great Lakes were trying to make this a safe way to travel. And indeed, today it is a safe way. So,
Yeah. Thank you so much, Valerie. We really
thank
appreciate
you.
your presentation. It was fabulous. Again, you can buy her birth book. We'll put the link in the chat again. And Valerie, there are some questions in the Q&A if you don't mind possibly typing some of the answers out so people can follow up by reading her book and through this. Thank you again, Valerie. And the final presentation is the automobile in Libertyville in the 1920s. With Jenny Berry. Jenny Berry is president of the Libertyville Historical Society and the local history librarian at the Cook Memorial Public Library. So if you ever go to the library, stop by, say hi to Jenny. She's friendly. She will help you out. She holds a BA in history from Augustana College, a Master of Library Science from Indiana University, and an MA in Public History from Loyola University, Chicago. And we appreciate Jenny being here tonight. She was a last-minute switch for us. So thank you, Jenny, and I will turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm Jenny Berry. I'm from the Libertyville Historical Society, and I'm very excited to be here for the 10th annual Lake County History Symposium. I was around for the first one, so it's amazing that it's been 10 years already. In keeping with this year's theme, planes, trains, and automobiles, I'm going to touch on a few ways automobiles played a role in Libertyville's history, especially in the 1920s. So to set the stage for the 1920s, I just want to do a brief history of some major growth points in Libertyville up to that point. A series of treaties ending with the 1833 Treaty of Chicago forced Native people out of the region. Anticipating the opening of the land by the U.S. government, the first prospective settler, George Varden, came to what would become Libertyville in 1835. As the land became officially available for sale, more people came, and by the 1850s, Libertyville had around 400 residents. In 1880, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad built an extension across the Des Plaines River into Libertyville from what is now Roundout. A residential and commercial building boom followed, and the village of Libertyville incorporated in 1882. In 1903, the Chicago and Milwaukee Electric Railroad constructed a spur from Lake Bluff to Libertyville on the south side of the village, which is, as Mr. Wasik mentioned, now the North Shore Bike Trail. Easier access to and from Chicago attracted newcomers, and the population doubled in the 10 years between 1900 and 1910, reaching 1,700 people by the end of that decade. So now that we've set the stage for Libertyville, I thought it might help to have just a brief history of the automobile. I am not an automobile specialist, so this is very high level. Some of the earliest motorized vehicles were electric. They were powered by batteries. And the availability of rechargeable batteries in 1859 helped things along. A self-propelled carriage was a sensation at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. And pictured at left is an electric vehicle built by an English inventor in 1884. There have been a few early steam-powered vehicles as well, but Carl Benz's 1886 gasoline-powered Patent Motorwagen transformed automobiles from novelties into more practical vehicles. Henry Ford started mass production of cars in 1908 with the introduction of the Model T. Ford's assembly line was more efficient and cost-effective, which in turn made automobiles less expensive and more accessible to the general public. In 1920, a Ford car cost $845, which is a little over $13,000 today. By 1928, the price was down lower than $300, which is about $5,500 today, which was within the range of skilled working men. The first automobile seen in Libertyville is thought to have come through town in 1895. That fall, the Chicago Times-Herald newspaper sponsored the first U.S. contest for motorized vehicles. Race participants were required to drive from Chicago's Jackson Park, north to Waukegan, and back to the city, finishing at the Grant Monument in Lincoln Park. Part of the race followed the Chicago and Milwaukee gravel road, which is known to us as Milwaukee Avenue, out of the city through Niles, Wheeling, Half Day, and Libertyville, before turning east on Grand Avenue in Gurnee. Over 85 vehicles registered for the November 2nd race, but just 3 arrived at the starting line, and only 1 vehicle made it to the finish, clocking a time of 9 hours and 30 minutes. And if you'd like a little more information about that race, the Dunn Museum has a Ready, Set, Go race virtual exhibit online through their website, which you can get more information on that race and other races in Lake County. Sources indicate that Will Holt, owner of the Holt Manufacturing Company, owned the first car in Libertyville. He owned a steamer, which in this case was described as a cross between a Stanley and a White, something like the car seen on the left. A close second was dentist Dr. L.E. Golding, who purchased a Cadillac in 1906. Cadillac offered 2 models that year, with prices ranging from $750 to $950. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but at the time, the average factory worker's annual income was under $700. Now, factory managers and dentists did a bit better, averaging about $2,000 to $2,500 a year. A 1906 item in the newspaper's local happenings column reported that the 2 men planned to form an automobile club and lobby to raise the speed limit beyond the existing 15 miles per hour. In his book, Crabgrass Frontier, The Suburbanization of the United States, historian Kenneth Jackson wrote that, quote, the decade after the end of World War I was the first in which the road and the car had full impact. And that statement rings true for Libertyville. The impact of the automobile on Libertyville in the 1920s can most clearly be seen in the rise of new businesses to serve car owners, actions of the local government, and the growth of the village. Business catering to horses are still quite prevalent in the 1913 telephone book, which is the earliest telephone book that in our collection, which has classified listings for automobile sales and services. On the right, you can see listings for buggies and wagons, harness manufacturers, liveries, and sales stables. On the left, you can see there are only 3 unique businesses selling or servicing cars. The Libertyville Garage, whose advertisement takes up more than half the page, was opened by George Quentin in 1911. It was the first business in town specifically for cars, and at the time was the only automobile garage in Lake County west of Waukegan. In 1914, Quentin sold the business and stock to John N. Bernard. In the 1914 photo on the left, Mr. Bernard's wife, Josephine, can be seen out front of the garage holding baby Robert with toddler Jack Jr. just to the right. Mr. Bernard is in the center of the 1935 photo on the right. The 1923 photo in the center shows a great view of the garage building on the west side of Milwaukee Avenue, just south of Lake Street, about where Casa Bonita and Shoku are today. The business, which eventually became Bernard Chevrolet, was operated by the Bernard family at this location and later on South Milwaukee Avenue until 2005. The Ree Motor Company was another early automobile business in Libertyville. In 1915, Albert Ree purchased the 2-year-old Just Motor Company on the west side of Milwaukee Avenue, a half block south of Church Street. Today, the building is home to Mickey Finn's Brewery. These photographs are likely from shortly after Mr. Ree bought the business, and I like them because they really show the car-horse duality of the time. On the left, you can see the Ree Garage is right next door to Ladd's Livery. And on the right, Mr. Ree shows off a circa 1915 Dodge next to a horse-drawn Standard Oil delivery vehicle. Mr. Ree moved his business a bit farther south on Milwaukee Avenue in 1924 when Charles N. Bernard, who had been working for his brother at the Libertyville Garage, bought the Ree building. His main garage serviced and repaired cars here for the next 12 years, and a string of automobile businesses occupied the building until the end of the 1950s. resold Hupmobiles and Nashes at his new location. It was news when Ree visited the Hupp Motor Company in Detroit in 1927 and drove one of the first Hupmobile 8s back to Illinois in a procession of 79 cars destined for the Chicago area, the largest delivery of 8-cylinder cars ever made at the time. Ree expanded the business by adding the community filling station and auto laundry, which had a magic car washing system, another sign that there was a growing market for automobile services. Ree Motor Sales stayed in the business until at least April 1945, and several other car companies were in that location for many years after. By the end of the decade, there were 20 car-related businesses in the telephone book classified listings. Except for perhaps the blacksmith, no horse-related businesses are listed in this 1929 telephone book. And it's probably a good guess that the blacksmith's horseshoeing business had also declined. As the number of automobiles increased, both state and local governments needed a way to fund road improvements. In 1907, Illinois enacted the Motor Vehicle Act, requiring motorists to register with the Secretary of State's office and pay a $2 fee per vehicle. In 1921, the Deerfield Village Board enacted Ordinance 318. The new law required residents with vehicles, car, motorcycle, or horse-drawn, to pay a wheel tax. We can see an example of the registration and fees on this 1923 cart. Fees varied by a vehicle's horsepower and use. Non-commercial automobiles under 35 horsepower paid $5. Over 35 horsepower paid $10. Now, in 1923, Ford Model T averaged about 20 horsepower, and the 1927 Hupmobile 8 that Mr. Ree drove was an estimated 50 to 60 horsepower. Just for comparison, the average horsepower of a car today is between 180 and 200 horsepower. We see light delivery vehicles also paid $5, and vehicles used for other commercial purposes paid $10. Now, from various blurbs in the newspaper, it doesn't sound like Libertyville residents were all that quick to comply. Notice was given in January 1922 that the village marshal would be on the lookout for people trying to avoid this ordinance. And in April 1924, the Libertyville Independent announced that Frank Just, who, by the way, was an editor of the rival paper, was facing arrest for not paying his wheel tax. Now, I'm assuming Mr. Just took care of it since there was no further mention of the issue in the newspaper. And one young man found a creative solution to avoid the tax. According to a 1927 local newspaper blurb, a young lad named Willis, owner of a Ford of uncertain vintage, had a great scheme to avoid paying the $5 vehicle tax. Each night, he would remove the plate from a car belonging to Mr. Clark of the Standard Oil Company and sally forth. So Willis was eventually caught. Mr. Clark recognized his number on the other car. And while no charges were filed, Liberal Marshal Limberry gave Willis a good talking to. Frank Just was just one of only 300 Liberal residents, or approximately 10% of the population, that were required to pay the wheel tax in 1924. In 1928, 812 automobile owners paid the tax, and halfway through 1929, the village had issued 916 vehicle tags, more than triple the number of 5 years prior, and almost one for every 4 residents, which was slightly above the Illinois ratio of 1 to 5. And that's just the number of purchase tags. So based on what we know about some residents' opposition to the tax, undoubtedly the number of vehicles in town was even higher. Now, as mentioned before, the funds from the various automobile taxes were intended for road improvements, and apparently they were very much needed. In 1920, the Chicago Daily Tribune invited readers to submit nominations for the world's worst road. A submission entitled Ode to Lake County argued Milwaukee Avenue should receive the honor, and I'd like to read a selection from that submission. Sir, allow me to nominate that unspeakable 10 miles of drainage ditch north of Wheeling as the great granddaddy of all the poor highway species. It is not fair to think of it in the same breath with honest 20th century transportation lines. It is the pariah of highway family, the leper among even those other road crimes in Lake County. Let the motorist who leaves Cook County concrete and ventures north through Half Day and Libertyville bid farewell to all he holds dear under his hood. 10 miles an hour over those awful chuck holes is breakneck speed. Faster is suicide. I'm glad to see the crying, the smile. This cracks me up every time I read it. You can see a bit of this in this May 1923 photograph of Milwaukee Avenue, looking north from about East Sunnyside Avenue. And I know I definitely would not want to drive over the potholes you can see in this picture. But even though paving was needed, in some cases, getting it done was a struggle. The 1920s was a golden age for road building. Libertyville benefited from a state of Illinois road building initiative, which began in the 1910s, but was interrupted by World War I. The project resumed in 1920, and by 1925, Illinois had constructed over 2,300 miles of newly paved roads. The first section of concrete road in Libertyville was on West Park Avenue from Milwaukee Avenue to the high school building, which at the time was on the corner of Park and Brainerd Avenues. At the time, the newspaper credited Judge Benjamin Miller with leading the effort. His family lived at 132 West Park, which is about where the Burnett Dane Funeral Home is today. He drummed up support among his neighbors and convinced them that it would be cheaper for the property owners to split the cost than to have to pay a special assessment to the village and have it done. Some were hesitant at first, but it seems all were happy with the result. So happy that in October 1922, the Libertyville Commercial Club hosted a 2-day carnival to celebrate this Libertyville first. Ahead of the event, the Libertyville Independent reported, "The paving of the first street in the history of Libertyville will be fittingly celebrated by a rip-roaring jollification with numerous amusements provided for all." Event planners invited every man, woman, and child of the village and surrounding country to attend, promising music to gladden the crowd, 2 nights of dancing on the new pavement, and Park Avenue homes resplendent in their best glad rags. Despite the chilly weather, event attendance was good, and even though prohibition was in effect, one party goer from Chicago was filled with booze and went to the hoosgow until he was sober enough to pick out a new hat to replace the one he lost at the carnival. While the Park Avenue project had come to a swift and successful conclusion, the Milwaukee Avenue paving project faced a bumpier road. The January 12, 1922 Libertyville Independent reported, "Paving of Milwaukee Avenue through Libertyville now assured. At last, it has been officially decided that Milwaukee Avenue is to be paved with cement. Libertyville people are jubilant." But 10 months later, 2 issues still stood in the way of securing a contract. The village had not obtained the right-of-way from landowners, and it remained unclear who would pay the cost not covered by the state. The state offered $56,000, or just over $1 million today, for an 18-foot wide pavement. The village wanted a wider road, which would cost $160,000, or about $3 million today. Throughout 1922, residents fought proposed funding plans to cover the difference, resulting in several hearings in county court and one before the Illinois Supreme Court. One local reporter had said that paving Milwaukee Avenue would mean more to the village than any improvement which has ever been made, but residents didn't entirely agree. They resisted a special assessment, declaring the paving would benefit only those with property on the road. Residents also fought a proposed bond issuance that would exceed the village's indebtedness. The state of Illinois was peeved by the delays and threatened to redraw State Route 21 to bypass downtown Libertyville. Under pressure, village leaders decided to narrow the planned road width to bring the project costs down. And village residents agreed to Milwaukee Avenue property owners paying 75% of the costs not covered by the state, with the balance paid through a village-wide special tax assessment. With this agreement, Liberty was able to secure the paving contract in time to keep the state funding. Milwaukee Avenue paving from Winchester Road to south of Rockland Road it began in May 1923, from Lake Bluff through Libertyville to Mundelein, today's Route 176. When the final section of this road was paved, the local newspaper called Libertyville a prominent highway center. 4 ribbons of concrete stretched away from the village, making it easily accessible to tourists attracted by its natural beauty and the picturesque estates in this vicinity. No longer was Milwaukee Avenue a pariah, at least through Libertyville. After all the paving, J.L. Jenkins, motoring columnist for the Chicago Daily Tribune, encouraged drivers to ride the new pavement through Libertyville and take a tour on the other freshly paved roads in the surrounding area. And as they say, if you build it, they will come. Or at least they do in Field of Dreams. With the newly paved roads came additional traffic, and of course, people complaining about the traffic. Now, historical photos show that Libertyville had some traffic control before the 1920s, but it appears to have been more directional than intended to control traffic flow. The sign seen in this photograph, right in the center here, this is a photograph of Armistice Day Parade in 1919, and the sign just says, "Keep to right." It's thought that the town marshal would sometimes stand on the platform to manually direct traffic. Stop and go crossing signal lights were installed at Park Avenue, Church Street, and Cook Avenue in August 1926 to help relieve congestion. The newspaper reported that the two uptown corners work simultaneously from the same master switch and give the Milwaukee Avenue traffic 50 seconds as against 20 seconds for the east and west vehicles. You can see traffic lights here on the corners of Milwaukee Avenue and Cook Avenue sometime before 1930. You might also notice something in the middle of the road, and I don't have a definite answer about what those are. My guess at the moment, and I'm referring to these little bump outs here, my guess at the moment is that they are a mushroom type traffic signal that serves a similar purpose to the keep to the right signs in the earlier photo to delineate lanes. Or possibly they're a part of the signaling system, but it's unknown whether the road and street corner equipment was installed at the same time or if they had any interconnectivity. And if anyone listening tonight has further information or ideas about what those bumps are in the middle of the road, please contact me. I'd love to hear from you. And my contact information will be on the last slide of this presentation. Milwaukee Avenue is a main route for those heading to Lake County Lake District. Cook County President Anton Cermak, who later became mayor of Chicago, who frequently traveled through Libertyville to his summer home in Antioch, was quite vocal about his dislike of the lights. He was not happy about the traffic, especially the lights through Libertyville. His complaints at a July 1927 Cook County Board meeting were published in the Chicago Tribune. Cermak said, on July 4th, automobile traffic was blocked on the Wisconsin highway through Libertyville by these lights until traffic jammed halfway to the state line. Traffic was halted 3 times at stoplights going through the village, despite the fact that no cross traffic was in sight. Well, I admit the traffic doesn't look too bad in this photograph. It's the only picture showing some traffic in approximately the right time period that I could find in our collection. Cermak and Liberal Mayor Earl Corlett exchanged letters to the Chicago Tribune's Voice of the People column. Corlett defended Libertyville stoplights and the rights of Libertyville citizens to be able to cross the street, especially on weekends when traffic was at its highest. Cermak's complaints continued off and on for at least 2 years. In 1929, Cermak appealed to the state highway department, asking them to force Libertyville to remove the lights on the state route. He didn't see the point of improving the road in Cook County to relieve congestion, which he controlled, if towns like Libertyville are permitted to blockade traffic with unnecessary stop and go lights. Now, Libertyville thought it was doing its job to regulate the traffic. Libertyville Police Chief Frank Druba and his staff hand operated the lights during the heaviest weekend traffic, being able to override the set time on the lights. And the newspaper claimed that the Milwaukee Avenue direction was at go 98% of the time. But the state sent inspectors to investigate. From a Friday morning to the next Tuesday morning, working in shifts of 8 hours each, men counted every car and pedestrian and how often the main traffic was stopped by the lights without a car or pedestrian present. Now, I just reached out to Illinois State Archives this week to see if they have the report, so I don't have the report in hand. Hopefully one day we'll find it. So I don't know the result of the study, but clearly stoplights are present in later photographs of Libertyville. So it would seem the highway department did not think removal was necessary. Before the street work began, locals considered paving to be the greatest stride forward in the history of Libertyville and prophesized that the new highways would be magnets attracting home seekers to this beautiful section, long known as the chosen land of millionaire estates. And real estate developers concurred. The Lake County Land Association, a real estate group with connections to industrial Samuel Insull, who was introduced to us earlier by Mr. Wasik, brought some of the largest parcels, including Libertyville's 1-mile tract, which became the Libertyville Highlands subdivision. The Copeland Manor subdivision was also originally platted in this decade, though most of the development happened after World War II. In the 1920s, farms were snatched up and the village annexed about 2,000 acres, which is over 3 square miles or over 1,452 football fields. Multiple subdivision plats were accepted. With my limited graphics skills, I've tried to roughly illustrate this using a 1930 census enumeration map. 1920 subdivisions are outlined, and NX line land is diagonally striped. In addition to the Libertyville Highlands and Copeland Manor subdivisions, other new subdivisions included Johnson's on the north, Oakwood Terrace just west of downtown, and the Charles Brum and William Brum subdivisions, B.H. Miller's first edition, and Sunnyside Park on the south. So the automobile drove growth in Libertyville in the beginning of the 1920s, but another form of transportation made an even bigger impact in the later half. The majority of Libertyville's growth occurred between 1924 and 1927, and that was spurred on by the announcement and the completion of the Skokie Valley branch of the Chicago North Shore and the Milwaukee Electric Railroad. Mr. Insel enters the picture again here. He had purchased the Flailing Electric Railroad in 1916 and made a lot of improvements, but the company's big 1920s initiative was a high-speed cutoff from Niles Center, now Skokie, to Libertyville. And the Skokie Valley line launched June 5th, 1926, just in time for the 26th International Eucharistic Congress held at the St. Mary of the Lake Seminary later that month. I know there were questions earlier about that. At next week's symposium, Norm Carlson will be presenting about the Congress and the North Shore Electric Railroad. The big thing is that Eucharistic Congress introduced people from all over the area to the Libertyville-Mundelein area, as it brought tens of thousands of people to our area. The decade of the 1920s witnesses Libertyville to continue to transform from a regional agricultural center to a commuter suburb of Chicago. The rise of the automobile and the improved North Shore Electric line played large parts. With 1,666 new residents, the increase in people in Libertyville in the 1920s was the largest up to that point. And with a growing population came other changes. New business blocks were built downtown, and key public institutions such as the Cook Memorial Library, Condell Hospital, and Rockland School were established to serve the expanding community. But despite a 1927 Chamber of Commerce prediction of continued growth, population growth and new construction plateaued as the decade came to an end. And then the Great Depression ground the boom to a halt. It would take the end of the Second World War to initiate Libertyville's next growth spurt. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
All right, Jenny, thank you so much for such a well-researched, enjoyable presentation. We already do have a question that's put in the Q&A. When was Butler Lake made and by who, if known? And could it possibly have been the Army Corps of Engineers?
So I don't have all of the details, but we do have a file on it at the Cook Memorial Public Library. It was a WPA project. Whether the Army Corps of Engineers was involved or not, I'm not sure, but we have many clippings in our file about that. If someone wants to contact me offline, I'd be happy to look into that more detail and or scan some articles and email them.
Someone else commented that they weren't sure what the bumps in that intersection on your slide were, but they'd like to know more.
Trying to figure it out for a while. I think we're pretty close, but I can't say for 100% sure.
Well, thank you again, Jenny. I'll give everyone just a minute because those just came in really fast. I'll give everyone a moment to think about other questions and think about questions in general for the whole night, right? We had 4 wonderful presentations. We'll take questions for Jenny first, but if you have other questions in mind as you've been thinking through all these, feel free to put those in the chat. I want to, again, take this moment to remind everyone that this is the first half of our Lake County History Symposium. So if you're interested in attending the second night of the presentation, which you will hear new topics, new conversations. Jenny already mentioned that Norm Carlson will be presenting on some of the North Shore Line and the Eucharistic Congress. And there will be a couple other things that will be presented on too. The naval base is going to be talking about the naval airplanes that were here. And there will also be one on Rockenbach Chevrolet, which I'm sure as soon as I say those words, you start thinking of the jingle in your head too. So please join us for the second evening. I'm double checking right now for quick questions. Oh, someone did comment. The bumps were lane markers with yellow lights, and they used them also in Milwaukee. And the Milwaukee Historical Society might have some more information on those.
Great. Thank you. That seemed to be the direction we were headed. So it's nice to hear someone else with that same information.
Yeah. This program was recorded tonight, so if you would like to watch the recording of this symposium, or if you would can't make it next week and want to watch next week, you can go to the Highland Park Historical Society's page, and they host these websites that host the webinars and the symposium on their YouTube page, so you can watch this year's or past years. Past topics have also been really interesting. We've done recipes and food, we've done good neighbors. So please check out the Highland Park Historical Society's YouTube page for more information on how to watch these recordings. And if you would like to learn more about Lake County Forest Preserves, again, you can visit us on our website and visit us on our calendar page to sign up for other additional programs. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for a wonderful evening talking about local history. And I hope you guys all walked away with an importance of why we do this program and why things like this matter. We had such wonderful speakers, and I hope you go and learn more about their topics and other things that they can share. Because again, with these short presentations, we're only able to cover a little bit. So I will end you with those thoughts for this evening and hope to see you next week